I'd like to introduce you to a good friend of mine, a kin board member, an entrepreneur, and a whole lot more, Mr. Dean DeBiase. Howdy, Dean.
Thanks, Rob. Welcome, everybody. Or is everyone at the beach? I don't know. I wish I was. So really, good morning. I have a fun thing for you this morning. As many of you have traveled the world, some of you actually have traveled with me, you've probably noticed there's an entrepreneurial movement sweeping the planet. But unlike other movements, this one is not reserved for secret places or special spots like Silicon Valley and Austin and other places. It's a democratized movement that is affecting change and growth in almost every organization, every city, every state, every county, every country around the world. And most of the coverage and awards and accolades go to the coolest startup and what cool activities and conferences are going on and the hip entrepreneur stateside. So what we thought we would do is kind of take you on a journey to see how well this movement is doing outside of North America. You guys up for that? Outside of North America? Get a little view? So to help us explore this, I've got some friends here that I want to bring up on stage, starting with Elmira. Elmira is a globe-trotting entrepreneur, globe-trotting meaning spotting entrepreneurs out there, and an author of a cool new book called From the Other Side of the World. Shelly, who runs the Reservoir Q, as well as Entrepreneurs for Hillary, is going to join us. It's probably not a good time to mention I had Donald Trump speak at my college class, but...
and I heard you were on his show.
Yeah, sorry, I was on a show too, but things happen. And it's actually a lot of fun. He is an entrepreneur, by the way. And I really want to welcome back, those of you that were here at KIN 2 years ago, Rajesh, who runs the GFS Accelerator in India, and also has a cool new startup called InnerChef. So we're going to talk about that as well. But I thought just to get going, we'd start with some stats just to ground everybody in what's going on. Some of you have probably heard of the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, GEM. It's a pretty good study. And the latest study, which is asking people questions, how they feel and things, is a survey across 60 economies from 2013 to today, really the end of 15, but it drifted a little bit into 16. And it shows a very healthy shift to and support of this emerging entrepreneurial ecosystems around the world. So the numbers I think look good. Over 50% of people polled think that an entrepreneurship is a good career choice. Never used to be that high before. Even in places like Chicago, where I live, it was, if you look back to 2002, it was at an all-time low. Over 60% perceive a high status of entrepreneurs in their societies. 3 countries from Asia economies came out with some of the highest levels of these indicators, like Kazakhstan, Philippines, Indonesia. Moving on, over 40% see good opportunities for actually starting a business. Now we're getting into the actual people that are going to do something. And only a third now feel that they're constrained due to field of failure. That's actually good. Field of failure is usually very high, so that's come down, which is a nice thing, especially for those of you who have felt that fear. Over half feel the ability to start a business now, so they're feeling very confident. And there's high levels of these indicators that can be seen in places like Barbados and Africa, including Senegal, Burkina Faso, and Botswana. And less than a fifth of these feel a fear of failure factor, so it's actually lower than the average, which is awesome. 3/4 of them have capabilities to actually start a company, whether it's money or capital or just support, and 20% actually intend to start a business over the next 3 years. And before we get started with the questions, I just thought we'd give you a little vertical emphasis to maybe help if we get to a Q&A later. So some of the verticals are agricultural in India, mining in Tunisia, manufacturing in Egypt, wholesale and retail in the Philippines, IT communications in Sweden and Belgium, finance in Slovakia, and professional services in Norway. So just to give you a little sample of what's going on outside the US. So I thought we'd start with a question about, many people know that failure is an issue with startups. And Elmira, you know this well. About 90% of companies typically fail. And I always say it's a good part of the cycle. But as you've gone around the world and met with entrepreneurs and seen this in various different countries, countries that some of us has probably never been to, have you seen this uptick, this confidence uptick? And is it impacting maybe the success of how these entrepreneurs are going to do? Or could this just be another little blip and things go back to normal and yeah, that was a nice experiment, or do you see it actually trending up?
Well, that's one of the reasons I went out and did research for my book, From the Other Side of the World. One of the questions I had was, when we say the word entrepreneur here in the United States, we automatically think of Silicon Valley, we think of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Google and Facebook. The minute you say the word entrepreneur, whether it's in the context of Africa, Asia, Latin America, or the Middle East, it automatically takes on a different context. People think of microfinance, people think of women doing handicrafts, and it's automatically something that's very small. And I went out to see, well, what is the truth out there? Because there are, they have the, you have the Alibabas, and then you have the Souk.com in the Middle East, and you have a few stars that are coming out of whether it's Latin America, Asia, or the Middle East, and I wanted to see what was the reality and what was happening. And what I actually found is that entrepreneurship is not just this fad or this trend that is going on, I mean, not only here in the United States, but around the world, but I think to go to your question, it's not just a blip. I think that at least what I found is one of the reasons that we haven't seen big entrepreneurial success stories coming outside of Silicon Valley isn't because Africa, Latin America, the Middle East lack any talent or ideas. They've just had so many more obstacles that they've had to deal with.
Sure, and they're not getting the press covers that... All right, so we'll come back to entrepreneurs in a bit. Shelly, what are you seeing going around the world in terms of the top challenge entrepreneurs are facing that, quite frankly, we take for granted here in the States? So we take for granted how we can scale companies. It's just, we know it, we can do it, it's no big deal, we got it.
Well, to build on what Elmira was saying, imagine if, and of course the iconic, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, or Steve Jobs had been born in Africa or Asia or Latin America. Do you think they would have been able to realize their potential? And similarly, imagine if each one of them had a sister who was equally innovative. Do you think she would be able to fulfill her potential? And Secretary Clinton always says that talent is universal, but opportunity is not. And in fact, when I was head of her senior advisor for global entrepreneurship at the US State Department, and we launched a global entrepreneurship program that ended up over the course of a couple of years reaching almost 150 countries, through a series of public-private partnerships, it was, in fact, to unleash this kind of potential. Having said that, to answer your question about the challenges particularly in emerging markets, not to speak about Sweden or some of the developed countries, which have their own challenges, believe it or not, for entrepreneurship. But the emerging markets, which is the topic this morning, is threefold. One, the institutional finance structures are simply not there. And we can, that's a whole day's conversation in and of itself. But the bottom line is, as more and more private sources of equity, so whether it's the entrepreneurs themselves, finding somehow, whether they have it themselves through their own savings, through their families, through crowdfunding opportunities now, as some of these more private funding sources emerge and grow and become more global, that will be a boon for entrepreneurs everywhere. And I point to places like Egypt. 9 months after the Arab Spring began, the revolution, we hosted a startup weekend in Alexandria, Egypt. And 2,100 applicants reached out. And among them, 800 participated. And for those of you who are familiar with the Startup Weekend phenomenon and global effort, typically in the US or other developed countries, you'll get 100 to 150 applicants with maybe 80 participants. So 2,100 applicants with 800, and that was in Alexandria, Egypt. And I could name you 15 of it. Ethiopia, we had a woman identifying, we launched an African women's entrepreneurship program, and one of the women from Ethiopia, after participating in a number of things, went back to Ethiopia and crowdfunded a women's bank. She got 10,000 women to each donate a certain amount of money, and they crowdfunded women. So on and on and on, these entrepreneurial instincts that people have all over the world are both addressing our real problems on the ground, but also addressing the entrepreneurial problems of lack of institutional finance, lack of opportunities sometimes in mentorship and that sort of thing, creating new networks, creating new sources of information and so forth. So those are some of the barriers that they're overcoming.
Okay, we'll jump into some of that.
Yeah.
Let's talk ecosystem. Rajesh, I was with Coastal Ventures last week in the Valley, and they're putting some money into India. And I think about $5 billion was invested in India startups in 2015. You've doubled the number of investors, like real accredited institutions or whatever, small groups anyway, and also doubled the number of accelerators, one that you run, which you previewed to the kin 2 years ago. So a couple questions. How's GSF doing, the accelerator? And give us the flip side of what Sam told us yesterday, because we left with a perception of all is not well, and I think you might have a different side of what's going on in India.
Yep. So 4 years back when I started angel investing and started my accelerator, I think there were 10 or 15 of us who were doing that. And I think today every mom and janitor is doing angel investing. That's awesome, I think. So last 2 years have been dramatic. I have not seen this kind of transformational shift in either way. One is the quality and quantity of startups has accelerated multifold. Love that. Secondly, I think the money has become far more easily available to startups at all stages. As I said, at angel stage or seed stage, where I was investing 4 years back, we were 15. I think there are 1,500 today who are doing that, right? As you said yourself, accelerators and incubators have multiplied. So this is a great time to be an entrepreneur in India. This is a time when all the forces are perfectly aligning. Of course, capital sometimes runs ahead of itself. I think 2015 was that year. There were overvaluation of some startups. Some flimsy startups get funded with no business model, but that's part of the capitalist game.
It's all part of the cycle.
It's part of the cycle. I think this year there's some cleansing happening, which is good.
Yep.
But we have today, 5 years back, there were hardly any unicorns in India. Today there are 9. And I can bet with you in
You're in a
5
race,
more years,
You're in a race with China right now.
there'll be
unicorn.
50.
Yep.
Yes, I don't know about China. I think that's
They had the
sort
most
of misplaced, that
Well,
comparison.
it's gone down this quarter, but they've got the most unicorns this year of any country.
Absolutely. So when I think in India, we had, in the early part of our tech evolution, we looked at US for inspiration, for business ideas and thoughts and leadership. In last 2 years, the other transformational shift is we're looking to East now. The bigger role model for us is Jack Ma, or founder of Xiaomi. In a way, it is still Steve Jobs and Zuckerberg and so on, but I think there is a clear thinking in Indian entrepreneurial system to look for inspiration in East now. What I call look East has become more dominant theme in India than look West.
You can't help to do that. I mean, most corporations are outsourcing more and more R&D to China, but the market is there. There's just too many people you can't ignore. Why would Apple invest $1 billion into Didi?
Absolutely.
And
I think the mobile era
even get a
belonged
board,
to
they didn't
US.
get a board seat for it. I mean, there's a clear message there.
Absolutely. I think the smartphones era belonged to US, with iPhone leading the evolution.
Yep.
But I have a sense that IoT is going to belong to China. That's someone should look here very deeply.
We're going to talk about that in the cybersecurity session, which I hope some of you come to. Yay. So let's move on to another one, if you don't mind. We'll talk about your startup later. So I'll go back to the GEM study again. So even though most entrepreneurs they're now motivated more by opportunity than necessity. Necessity is like, oh my God, I have to make money or I'm going to die. So opportunity is a little different. Some stats on women are nearly 1/3 more likely to start businesses out of necessity versus opportunity than men. And women show equal or higher entrepreneurship rates than men in Vietnam, Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, Peru, and Indonesia, one of Rob's favorite places. And female entrepreneurship is growing very strong in places like Luxembourg, Greece, Ecuador, Colombia, and Panama as of now. That just happens to be trending very high. So what are we seeing in female entrepreneurship? I guess I'll ask the females first. What's going on?
Well, I'm actually writing my second book about this very topic, looking at women entrepreneurs around the world and what are the various trends. And what's interesting is, there is, I think, in all the countries that you talk about, there is an uptick. I think a lot of women are entrepreneurs out of necessity. and not opportunity. They're looking to actually just take care of their families and to sustain themselves. So it is a very different type of an entrepreneurship. But I think that when we talk about female entrepreneurship, and I think it holds very true even here in the United States, there are still very great challenges. I think, we hear about the discussions about women in tech here in Silicon Valley and, them not being able to break into the boys club, not being able to access the capital, not having access to the networks. And I think that that's very true around the world as well. And even more so in very patriarchal societies. I think though, when we're looking at the opportunity, I think a couple of things are happening that are in favor for women around the world. I think one is the nature of the smartphone and technology. I think technology has just really enabled women to access information, to be at home, and to have the flexibility of being an entrepreneur from the home and to be able to do that. And it is also empowering. I think that one thing that we often forget about technology, it's not just a tool for communication, but I think what these women are also doing around the world is that they're getting in touch and seeing the role models around the world and seeing what other people are doing. And I think that, it may sound hokey, but there is the multiplier effect when you do actually see someone else, whether they're in Guatemala or in Brazil, and they're able to do something. I think it does inspire other people to do it. The one interesting thing that I have found, at least in my initial research, is, we talk about gender parity, and we think that, if we get to more equality, we're going to get more female entrepreneurship. And what I've actually found is that's not actually true. When you look at entrepreneurship rates among women in the Scandinavian countries, particularly Norway and Sweden, they're on par with South Korea and Saudi Arabia. And so, then what is it that is preventing, women from actually starting these things up? And I think there are a number of different factors. I think when you're looking at the Scandinavian countries, I think they have a good social welfare system. And apologies, I'm a diehard Democrat, and apologies to all my Democratic friends, but I think that there is a case about, when you do have the handouts and the government taking care of, there's not that incentive to actually go out there and to try to start up something. I think on the other hand, I think when you're looking at societies like South Korea and Saudi Arabia, I think the challenges are also logistical. If you're in Saudi Arabia and you can't actually drive a car, how can you be a female CEO and the head of a startup if you actually need to get products and services out there? So I think that there are a number of different things that we have to look at when we're talking about women in entrepreneurship.
Yeah, I'm not big into the handouts, but I will say I was on the board of one company in Finland that the government would give up to $1 million, and they've had a very good track record of it because they've taken out, the fraud and abuse and the likely to fail. But it is interesting how it's happening in certain countries.
Well,
Shelly, anything to
I
add?
just want to build on that. There's a bit of a different spin on the handouts thing, and I do a lot of work in Sweden, actually. 77% of women are employed in Sweden in the economy. So one factor is that women can work in the economy and they can thrive. Okay, in a way that they can't. Sweden has the highest rate of female employment of any OECD country in the world. So that's part one. So, not the handout per se, but it's if you can, you graduate university, you can get a job, you can get a well-paying job, and by the way, it has benefits. That's part one. But part two is the following, and that is you only get those social benefits. Okay, you get family leave, but you only get those social benefits. Your employers, if you work for somebody, if you are the entrepreneur, you have to provide those social benefits, right? So there's a double whammy there as an entrepreneur. So those are some of the other things that are behind this. It's not as simple as saying it's all about handouts.
Yeah, we were talking about grants. I mean, they're actually granting startups money, and I've seen it work very well, and I've seen the dark side as well.
Right.
All right.
Just one thing to add.
Yeah, I wanted
one thing
to comment.
add, though.
Yep.
Also, I think this is not just about women entrepreneurs. I think you are seeing a rise of entrepreneurship around the world because you are seeing more people in the middle class. And I think, Rajesh, I think you touched upon this. I think when people are no longer in the situation of survival, when they have to think about, how am I going to, make ends meet, and they have some disposable income, I think you have the comfort of having people go in and try to solve problems, which, the way that I look at entrepreneurship and define it is entrepreneurs are people who go out there and solve problems, they're filling gaps. And I think you are seeing a rise around the world of not only men, men in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East, but I think this is why you're also seeing a rise for women, because women have much more access to healthcare, to disposable income, and they're much more in the middle class. And entrepreneurship, I think, for the most part, is driven by the middle class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's always a drive and a need there.
I also wanted to point out the other big shift in women entrepreneurs is funding, particularly in the U.S. So it might surprise you to hear that even here in the U.S., only 2.4% of women entrepreneurs ever get to $1 million in revenue. So forget about unicorns. We're even talking about thriving companies, but they never get to $1 million, and that's about a fifth the rate of all male-founded companies. But the big thing
that blends in a lot of startups that probably cap off at $1 million anyway. I mean, they're just great little businesses. They don't necessarily have to go to 10 million. So.
Well, they don't have to, and they don't get to, and there's a missing middle section of people who want to grow their business, women who want to grow their businesses, and they get stuck. But anyway,
that's the category.
Yeah, but the other big shift that's happening, it started in the U.S. and it's starting to happen in other places, is that women, as they're successful, whether they're successful as corporate executives or as entrepreneurs, are starting to fund other women-founded businesses, and that is a shift. And while we haven't seen it affect the percentages, what we know is, for example, Golden Seeds. It's an angel capital network that started about 9 years ago. Stephanie Van Hamberry Brown, now her name is Newbie, started it too. She came out of JP Morgan. She was an executive of JP Morgan, retired young, had plenty of cash, decided, what can I do? Let me start funding these women-founded businesses that aren't otherwise getting funded. Today, Golden Seeds is the third largest angel network in the United States and only funds women businesses that have women funders. And there are now a plethora of those, both angels and other kinds of organizations that will fund, they're focused on funding.
We're seeing a lot of good momentum there. Can I just flip it a little bit? Let's see, it used to cost about $5 million to get a good startup running. Like when I sold Imagination Network to AOL back then, you had to build your own data center, you had to do everything. You had to write the code, you had to get down to the kernel level of the box to make sure it would go fast enough. It's crazy stuff. No one knows what I'm talking about. Now you can start a company like $5,000, and most people are starting it for less, which is good for democratization of this. But is it too easy to start companies, Rajesh, now? Could there be too many of these?
I think it's awesome that it's too easy. I think we must thank Jeff Bezos and AWS for enabling
AWS helps, sure. Just liquid servers, just turn it on.
Yeah, I think what's happened in last 10 years is the cost of doing digital entrepreneurship has come down dramatically, but the barrier to creativity has risen dramatically.
I'm concerned about that because when I went to the Slush conference, as a speaker, you get the preview package, and they sent it to me in Excel, which is really dangerous.
Yeah.
And I sorted all the companies from around the world. There were 15,000 people, like 8,000 startups, and I could just group them in all these copycat categories. I won't go through them.
Yeah,
so 20 of these, 20 of these, 20 of these. Creativity low, excitement high.
Yeah, I want to explain that. So, and that's because everyone is seeing everything in digital world, and it's become easy to copy. Now, last 10 years has been about a thesis that some very smart people across the world executed. I call the thesis this of that.
This of that.
This of that. Now, think of, we have a company in India which is called Flipkart. So how do we describe it? It's Amazon of India, right? You have Didi in China. You'll call it Uber of China. You have Xiaomi. You will say Apple of China, right?
Yeah. The Uber of this, the Keurig of that, it just goes on and on.
So 10 years back, few people got it. They sat down and they said, okay, what's working in United States? Amazon, Apple, Uber, this. And what are the big markets? Germany, US, China, India, Indonesia. They mapped it out. And then they put relentless amount of money behind it. So 2 companies, I'll take an example of this, who executed this strategy to the T. One is Rocket Internet. Rocket Internet's first success in Germany came out of a copycat, which they sold to Amazon. They learned fast from it, and they started creating copycats of what was working in US across the world. But the strategy they took was to create their own operating companies, right?
Right.
It worked, but mixed results. right? In India, for example, it's been a spectacular failure because of another strategy, which was implemented by someone called Lee Fixel from Tiger Global, a hedge fund, right? They pooled in massive amount of capital, and then they went to Excel India or Sequoia India and said, what's good in your portfolio which looks like Amazon? What's good in your portfolio that looks like Uber? And then they went to Flipkart and put massive amount of money behind it. Or they went to Ola, for example, in India. They didn't, someone else went. And they said, okay, it looks like Uber. They backed it, but as a VC, right? And now, 10 years back, that thesis has played out. We are today in 2016 seeing the end of that thesis, this or that.
Right.
That thesis is now played out. New thesis has to begin, and that new thesis will create unprecedented new amount of wealth creation opportunities.
Especially as things slow down. Every time you hit a correction, they all kind of run away. And sometimes the copying is okay. Facebook, take that, MySpace, that worked. How many of you still have a MySpace account? We're going to talk about that in the cybersecurity section.
How many of you ever
Wait
had
till you see Rob's photo on MySpace. It's hilarious. But I was in the coupon business when the daily deal spike happened. So Groupon came out. There was 300 daily deal companies, and they all went away. So you mentioned the word creativity. I think that's an interesting one to kind of kick around the couch here is, I mean, one of the things Steve Jobs said was taking LSD was one of the top 2 or 3 things that he really did in his life that he really thought was an important thing in his life. So I think that sparked a lot of his creativity. So how do we get more creative, sustainable, smart companies, maybe without taking LSD, I guess would be the way there in various countries, because they do sit back on their phone and they look and they go, well, shoosh, they're doing that, let's do that. It's easy. We even see students at Kellogg doing that. They just copy.
Yeah, I think as you see more diversity being supported, and whether it's global diversity or even within our own country, you will see, because as you get more diverse players, you get more, they're facing different kinds of problems that they then turn around to solve. And I agree with Elmira. I mean, a real entrepreneur is fundamentally a problem solver. It's not about becoming a unicorn. It's about seeing a problem. It's when Travis Kalanick stood on the corner in San Francisco and said, can't find a cab in San Francisco. Wouldn't it be cool if I could just touch my phone and a car shows up and I don't even have to have cash in my pockets, and I go riding off into...
The car showed up even before I touched my phone.
Yeah, well, there you go. But I'm saying that, it seems like a simplistic thing. And how many of us have been in that situation? I lived in the Bay Area for 18 years, I faced that situation numbers of times. But somebody to say, why not? Why not? I could solve that problem. We can do that.
Can we?
But
So-
just to get to this point, I
Yep.
mean, you're talking about creativity.
Creativity.
But I don't necessarily think the copycat phenomenon is actually a bad thing throughout the world. And I think what we're seeing, and I think Jack Ma proved this, when he set up Alibaba, it was a race between Alibaba and eBay. And eBay said, eBay went in there and they were going to roll out, their model in China, and they were going to be the kings. And Jack Ma actually tweaked on it. He actually created a version of eBay for the Chinese because he understood the Chinese consumer. Right. And I think what the key there is that these entrepreneurs may be copying it, but they are tweaking it for the market. And when they're doing that, they're actually starting to build the foundations for the ecosystem, because they're actually starting to bulldoze down the obstacles that have previously prevented them from creating the eBays and the Hewlett-Packards and the Googles. And now what you're seeing is the second generation, because I have been tracking entrepreneurs for the past 10 years. And what I've seen is, whether it's in Turkey, Mexico, Nigeria, yes, they have the Groupons, they have the Facebook clones, they have all the e-commerce clones, but now what I'm seeing is now the second generation, because they've actually made the return. And what we're not talking about here is not just the creativity and the ideas, but it's the money and the financing that's coming in with it. So I agree with Rajesh that it's great that there's all this money out there, because it means that there's money to be made here. And so they've established that money can be made, and now what's happening is you're seeing the second iteration, and they're getting smarter. They're not becoming consumer-facing, and they're learning the lessons of early Silicon Valley, which was all about B2B.
Yep.
And now they're starting to actually become creative and saying, how can we actually solve the problems for businesses and grow in that market?
And potentially in our country, like a lot
can
of
I
water
just-
startups in Africa and things like that.
Can
Do you
I just
agree with
build on it
Do you agree with that, or?
Yeah, so in a different way. So Paytm is, in my view, a very disruptive company in India. It's backed by Alibaba and is solving a payment problem. For example, in India, we leapfrogged many things. We leapfrogged landlines with mobile phone. We are leapfrogging now, I think, our payments. We never had credit cards. We're going to wallets directly. And that insight did not come from US, because US never had to solve that problem. That was a Chinese problem. And Alipay solved it, right? And Alipay solved it because he built a e-commerce infrastructure, copying Amazon, but he solved a payment problem which was typical Chinese. And from there, we borrowed something called Paytm. The system had already started. The Paytm had got born on its own, but Alipay came in and backed that company with, I think, $500 million, and is going to become perhaps the biggest bank in India in the next 5 years, right? So the point I'm trying to make is, in the first generation, a lot of money comes in, creates copycats. But in the second generation, those copycats start innovating today. So look at China, where I think Baidu is doing perhaps a little more cutting-edge work than even Google, right? And similar things are happening around with Xiaomi on newer devices, on IoT that are coming out, and Segways and stuff that is happening. So it's all right in massive economies like India and China for initial copycatting to happen so that the ecosystem develops. And as the ecosystem develops, then incentives are created in the economy on creativity. And those companies then become bold enough to go to the world with their models. I think that's what is happening.
Right, that's a good shift to ecosystems. So years ago when we founded 1871 in Chicago, it's one of the largest digital incubators in the world, we pretty much set up an artificial ecosystem, almost forced it. And there was only a few little incubators around. Now there's over 50 that really matter. And this is happening repeatedly in every country you guys have been to. And you know that. And I was asked, we did this talk at the UN, I was asked how did it become so successful so quickly? And I said, it's really about the non-entrepreneurs, the people that are not building these companies, but it's people like us that are on the couch here that are actually helping them. So everything from mentors to connectors who are connecting them to whatever they are. Corporations in Chicago is a huge one. So that was an easy layup for us. And then ambassadors, the ones who are actually going to keep that movement going. So when I look and travel around other countries, and I kind of look at the city and I go, is this a sustainable movement? Does it have the non-entrepreneurs who are actually going to rise this thing up, whether it's civically or whether it's the people that made the money already, like in Boston, and are you going to reinvest it or just keep walking away from your economy? What are we seeing out there, and how do you feel that, what's the secret to keeping these going?
This is something that I've done a lot of work in as we built up the Global Entrepreneurship Program. And since leaving the State Department in 2013, I've continued to do a lot of this work in different parts of the world. I think the single most telling factor about whether the ecosystem will be successful is whether there are public-private partnerships. Okay. I mean, if you had to say one single thing that would, differentiate an ecosystem that will be successful from those that won't, because there are essential things that only the private sector can do. Governments cannot do. They don't know how to do it. They shouldn't do it. They'd be bad at doing it, and it'd be a waste of resources. And then there are things that the government must do in terms of creating enabling environments that only the government can do. So whether it's incentives for investors, if you're really truly starting up, or whether it's eliminating barriers for startups, whether it's, there's a whole array of things, regulatory environment. And
this is one thing, those of you from other countries, I probably would not copy the US as much because it's situational for not just every country, every city. What works in Paris is not going to work in Delhi. It's just very, very different. So how is that going in India? The actual ecosystem, is it real? Is it sustainable?
It's building up. I think there are three important constituencies that need to develop. One is educational institutions. Mm-hmm. We have IITs and we have IIMs, which are top-notch institutions, low on R&D, but excellent on talent. Perhaps the best talent in the world comes out of there. Many of them come to Silicon Valley or wherever, and they do so well. Many of them have now sort of started to not go out of India and work on their ideas, right? That's awesome. The second part of the puzzle is, I think, the corporate world. And that's where Valley is awesome, right? Because it does 2-3 things. It provides not only jobs, it also does what we call M&As, low-level M&As, acqui-hires, gets the capital to recycle, all of that happens. The third part is the venture ecosystem, the money providers. So be it angel, seed, private equity, venture funds, growth funds, hedge funds.
Which is pretty much tripled.
I think that part is developed in India pretty robustly in the last 2 years.
Including American VCs popping in.
Yes, and now Chinese money, Japanese money is also coming into India in massive amounts, right? I think that will overtake American money now. The last part is government, and that's a tricky question. What's the role of the government? In countries like Singapore, government plays a lot of proactive role, provides capital, does a lot of ground activities. I think in India, the role of the government, in my view, is to stay away, build infrastructure. What we need is strong infrastructure in India. Indian entrepreneurs are strong enough to take care of the rest, and I agree with you there. So that's where Indian government has let people down in many ways. If they just could focus on building robust infrastructure, great policies, non-corrupt governance, Indian entrepreneurs have it in them to build massive companies.
So corporate venture capital invested $2.5 billion in Q1, which is like a quarter of all investment. It's never been that high, or a bigger percentage. So not overtaking VCs. That, by the way, that does not include the $1 billion Apple just kind of gave to Didi. Do you think India has that appetite where corporations will really step up?
Yeah, it has. So corporate venture capital is a good thing, but I think is misdirected at this point of time. It's mostly going late stage.
Yeah.
Be it Amex or be it, I've spoken to all of them, many of them, and
There's some in the audience that do
Yeah.
early stage, though. Maybe they're
they
not
need to go.
maybe
I
not in
think
India.
they're running in 2 directions. One is they're saying most of the 2.5 billion is going late stage. And then they're sprinkling some capital in sort of saying, let's do some accelerator. Let's launch a Wrigley accelerator, which is sort of good, but I'm not so convinced about that model. I think they're going through their learning. They're seeing massive amount of value creation around themselves. They're seeing threats coming from new players, be it Tesla threatening BMW or whatever. So they're reacting. This is the first reaction. So first reaction is set up $300 million corporate venture fund. Second reaction is set up with $5 million or $10 million in accelerator program. I think innovation is not going to happen with either of them. It will require a lot more than this, if that's what they're looking for.
So just some closing thoughts. I introduced a term at Kin, I think it was last year. I think it was entrepreneur. So when things actually aren't going that well. So I was just hoping we could just end on, where are you seeing in countries where it's not working if you do this, but it's working great when you do this? So the flip side of it, just to give us some examples. Moving on from India for a minute here.
Yeah, I think there's this phenomenon of, where's the next Silicon Valley? Mm-hmm. And I think that's the wrong question to ask. I think that your point about, what works in Paris isn't going to work, in Chicago. What works in Silicon Valley is not going to work in Lagos or in Istanbul. I mean, it's just a different context. And so I think that when the ecosystems are just tapping into what they have and the resources and building up the ecosystem that really leverages the talent that's there, I think that's really when you're seeing it work. I also think big countries like India and China, I think that's where you're starting to see like the big unicorns and the big companies coming out of. And I think smaller countries, I think what they need to start thinking about is pooling regionally. So what,
like Slovenia, you've been
right to Slovenia and like the whole Balkan, the whole Eastern Europe, coming together as a block, and whether it's the Caribbean or smaller countries, and actually banding together, and instead of trying to think about it as doing as individual countries.
Love it. Shell?
Yeah. I think one of the key challenges we face on the plus side is this other revolution, the entrepreneurial revolution, and whether it's India literally any other part of the world, because the young people are online, they see what's going on elsewhere, and they want a part of it. They want to be able to have some control, as they perceive it, of their futures when youth unemployment is just the highest it's ever been in the world, and it's not, it's not being solved anywhere in the world, really. But on the downside is the lack of the resources to mentor. And in the end, though I focused on finance when you asked me the first question and said, institutional financial structures are still very elementary in many, many, many countries, certainly emerging markets. Really what's lacking more than that are the incubators, are the mentors, or whatever. But the good news is, of course, where it is working, is now people are starting to realize, well, they have all the online resources. Maybe I don't need a mentor. So that's solution number one, or I can get a mentor online.
And I can start a company for a couple $1,000.
Right.
Does that help?
And then the second thing, and you and I had a bit of a disagreement back there about this, because you were talking about entrepreneurs who are working at Google and think that they're entrepreneurs,
Or
but they're
Goldman
really
Sachs.
not, or
They're
Goldman
like,
Sachs,
"Hey,
or wherever
I can
they're
dress
working.
nice, but I like the
And
paycheck."
as someone who started my career on the corporate side, I worked for American Express for 10 years. Then I was Chief Retail Marketing Officer at Bank of America during a historic time where we turned the bank around, and then left to start my first of 6 companies. I would tell you that the skills that I acquired, the networks that I developed, of people who knew me, believed me, especially as a young woman entrepreneur in this, we're talking now about the early 90s, was essential. I don't think I could have done what I did. And I founded, or co-founded 6 companies
You
with
learned how
5
to scale.
successful exits and over $200 million raised.
Yeah.
And I can assure you, in those days, as a woman, and I had co-founders who were men and women in a couple of cases,
Sure.
we would not have raised that money without the contacts that I had made earlier. So, I mean, I do actually think for other parts of the world it's essential, if they can find jobs, that actually, that is a good path for them to build some of these skills that will then empower them when they have the idea, when they think about solving, they come out of IIT, they have the technology background, but they don't have the business background necessarily. And that's where, these other strategies are really important, I think, for the future.
Great, thank you. Rajesh, entrepreneur, good and bad?
I am massively, massively optimistic about the future of entrepreneurship. I think I will borrow Robert's metaphor of Renaissance. What we've seen in the last 10, 20 years is just the very early part of a massive disruptive world we're going to face. My 2 kids are there in the audience. I feel happy for them.
Where are they?
They're there, son. They are...
Where are the kids? There they are. Thanks for coming.
I think there is no reason to fear anything. Let's embrace the future. We are going to live in a very different world than we lived in the past. It's a connected world. Massive amount of newer opportunities are opening in different parts of the world, thanks to new tools of technology that we have acquired. Human beings, like my 2 sons, are liberated now, right? They are fearless.
Can I add to
I'm
that?
glad they're human beings, too. Sheesh, that was...
Can I add to that my daughter,
Sure.
our youngest of 4 kids, 25-year-old, her first venture, goes to New York through some friends who were, they were friends when they were kids, who are now working at Morgan Stanley, and on their first meeting with the first pitch, raises $500,000 for her first venture, and it's like, what? That never happens, but that's what the world is like today. So you have a great idea, you learn how to pitch it, you understand what the economics are, you have a good business model, and there are investors out there, and they were all male investors too, there weren't any women among those investors.
Absolutely.
And they'll
And
support
if you're
it.
creative,
Right.
and if you have
Right.
tools, and if you get it, people are willing to back you. It never happened in humanity ever
Right.
before.
Right, I
Yeah,
agree.
this is
Awesome.
definitely a renaissance. So just to close, I would just encourage everyone in the audience to kind of just do the power of and. It's like, yeah, I got this corporate job, and I could also do something else. I could volunteer at Incubator, Accelerator. Every city, every vertical, everything is covered. You don't even have to travel far. You could be on a trip to Europe and actually hang out in one of our partnership incubators over there. You could help civically in a country where your company is. You can actually, a lot of this entrepreneurialism actually rubs off on your company. So I know many of you do that now, but I encourage you to come up and talk to the team here and just see where you might want to put your toe in the water. We'd appreciate it. So with that, Rob, you're writing feverishly, so I won't do my closing comments. I think you should do yours.
Thank you. This is great. So Just a moment. First of all, Shelly and Rajesh, thank you so much for coming back and being with us and being truly part of the kin. And we're in touch on a regular basis. And Shelly, your service to the world by being part of a relatively constructive campaign in the midst of this situation. Someone who has some experience that is relevant. Thank you so much for that. And Elmira, welcome to the club, or the cabal, however you'd like to think about it. Shelly and Elmira have probably the broadest perspective of anyone I know about what's going on in entrepreneurship in the world. You can read their bios. It doesn't say up here, but Elmira used to be with Endeavor, which if you're not familiar with Endeavor, you should look into them. Extraordinary impact on getting entrepreneurs from beyond their start to how do they then scale. And of course, you heard from both of them of their roles in the world. They're very unique roles in the sense there aren't that many of them. I understand unique just means one, but we're giving that up. Rajesh, an Asian perspective, you called us out a little bit. You said, yeah, you know, China and Japan, they're coming, they're a lot more. I think they're going to eclipse the United States. And they have, in China, for instance, and other places, more to offer us in some ways because they have some similarities to our environment that certainly the United States doesn't have. So what do we do? Are we okay with that? Is that fine? Are there cases where we can do better, we can up our game and get back in that game? And that's a heck of a call to action. You said it's awesome that it's too easy. Now let's be clear, it's still really hard to be an entrepreneur. We're sugarcoating this, I go and I get my $500,000 and I'm on my way. It's still incredibly hard to be an entrepreneur, but it is shockingly more easy from a digital perspective. And as Jeff Immelt said recently, a few months ago, he said, if you go to bed a manufacturer, you wake up a software company. So this isn't just online gaming. This is starting to hit across sectors. And to sort of wrap this all up, I think I can tie some of this together, the wantrepreneurs, the manurepreneurs, or I don't know how many tweets you were going for here, Dean, but yeah, all hashtags. I have something I use a lot called the Branson dimension. It's the dimension of entrepreneurial-ishness about people. And on one side of the dimension, it's a really big dimension, so give me a minute, is Richard Branson. So all the way over here is Richard Branson. He couldn't work for anyone else if he tried. He probably would jump out of a window without a parachute if he were trying to work for somebody else. Now, on the other end of the dimension, it's a big dimension. All the way over here, somewhere past Dean, this is someone who should just work for the Department of Motor Vehicles. There isn't a single ounce of entrepreneurship in this person. The reality is that all of us are somewhere in the middle. And what oftentimes corporations, governments, they'll say, how do we get more entrepreneurs, more entrepreneurial people? They look over here to this side and say, how do we get those people to come? How do we get Rajesh to come and work full time for us? Here's the answer. You don't. And don't try. What you should try to do is move the line over this way a bit and capture some of these people who have entrepreneurial capabilities and drive and purpose, and they're seeking that purpose and a place to rise up, but they understand how to navigate inside big sclerotic companies like my good friend Dennis Brown at SAP, who's made innovation happen, believe it or not, at SAP. He's helped to make that happen. That kind of person is what we want in the corporation and the government, and it's different in different places. We all have it inside it. We have to find it. And you people have all found it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.